The champagne glass slipped from Wade's trembling fingers, shattering against Harold's mahogany desk, as Marcus Reed, our family attorney for 30 years, cleared his throat and repeated the words that drained every drop of color from my son's face. "Did you even read Clause 7, Wade? But let me back up. Because, honey, this story starts 3 weeks earlier at my husband's funeral, where my supposedly loving son made it crystal clear what he thought of dear old mom. Where are you watching from today? Drop your location in the comments below and hit that like and subscribe button. I'm Dorothy Hartwell, and for 43 years, I played the perfect wife to Harold Hartwell, real estate mogul and owner of Hartwell Industries. While he built his empire worth $40 million, I raised our only child, managed his social calendar, and smiled graciously at charity events where people praised my husband's business acumen. What they didn't know was that behind every great man's success was a woman who actually read the fine print. The funeral was everything Harold would have wanted: elegant, expensive, and packed with people who owed him money. Wade, my 42-year-old son, played the grieving heir to perfection, accepting condolences while calculating his inheritance in his head. I could see it in his eyes, the way they lit up when old business associates mentioned the value of the company, the properties, the investment portfolio. After the last mourner left and we returned home to the estate Harold had built for us in Connecticut, Wade didn't waste time with sentiment. I was still in my black funeral dress, still wearing Harold's favorite perfume because it comforted me, when he cornered me in the kitchen with his wife Angela hovering behind him like a vulture in designer clothes. "Mom, we need to talk about practical matters," he said, loosening his tie with the impatience of a man who'd been waiting for this moment longer than he cared to admit. "Dad's gone, and that changes everything." I poured myself a cup of coffee with hands that weren't quite steady. "What exactly are you saying, Wade?" "I'm saying you can't stay here. This house is too big, too expensive to maintain. You're 68 years old, and frankly, you're going to need care soon." Angela nodded sagely behind him, as if she'd been practicing this speech. "We've looked into Sunset Manor, that lovely place about an hour from here. Very upscale, lots of activities for people your age." The casual cruelty of it hit me like a slap. 3 hours after burying my husband, my son was shipping me off to die among strangers. "Wade, this is my home. I've lived here for 25 years. He shrugged, already moving toward the door. "Not anymore. According to Dad's will, I inherit everything. The business, the properties, all of it. I'm being generous by letting you stay until we can arrange your transition." He paused at the doorway, and that's when he delivered the line that changed everything between us forever. "Pack your bags, old lady. You're moving to a nursing home." The next morning, I called Marcus Reed. Marcus had been Harold's attorney since before Wade was born, but more than that, he'd been Harold's friend. When I called him the morning after Wade's charming performance, there was something in Marcus's voice that made me wonder if he'd been expecting my call. "Dorothy, my dear, how are you holding up?" His voice was warm, but I detected an undercurrent of something else. Anticipation, maybe? "I've been better, Marcus. Wade seems to think I'm heading to a nursing home next week. Something about inheriting everything?" There was a long pause on the other end of the line. "Dorothy, when was the last time you actually read Harold's will?" The question caught me off guard. Well, Harold always handled our legal affairs. I signed what he told me to sign, trusted what he told me to trust. "Why?" "Because I think it's time you came in for a visit. Are you free this afternoon?" Marcus's office hadn't changed in 20 years. All dark wood and leather-bound law books that probably cost more than most people's cars. But Marcus himself looked older, frailer, like he was carrying a secret that had been weighing on him for far too long. "Dorothy, I need to ask you something, and I want you to be completely honest with me." He settled behind his massive desk, Harold's will spread out before him like a battle plan. "Did Harold ever mention a woman named Catherine Morrison to you?" The name hit me like a physical blow. Catherine Morrison, Harold's secretary for 15 years, the one with the perfect figure and the way of looking at my husband that made my skin crawl. The one who'd left the company suddenly 2 years ago, right around the time Harold started working, late more often. "She was his secretary," I said carefully. "Why?" Marcus's expression grew grim. "Because 3 years ago, Harold came to see me in a state I'd never seen him in before. He was panicked, Dorothy, terrified. Catherine Morrison was threatening to go public with some information that would have destroyed him." The coffee I'd been sipping turned bitter in my mouth. "What kind of information?" "The kind that could have landed him in federal prison for tax evasion and fraud." She had documents, Dorothy, proof that Harold had been skimming money from his company, hiding assets, avoiding taxes on a massive scale. She wanted $5 million to keep quiet. I set down my cup with trembling hands. My husband, the man I'd trusted with every aspect of our life, had been a criminal. What did he do? He paid her. But more than that, he realized he needed to protect you from the fallout if his crimes ever came to light. That's when he asked me to draft a very special addition to his will. Marcus leaned forward, his eyes intense. Clause 7, Dorothy. Did Wade mention Clause 7? My heart was racing now. He said he inherited everything. That's what he was supposed to think. Harold was very specific about that. Marcus turned the will around so I could see it, pointing to a section I'd never noticed before. Clause 7 states that if Harold dies under suspicious circumstances, or if his business practices are ever called into question by federal authorities, his entire estate reverts to his wife, with his son receiving exactly $1. I stared at the paper, the words swimming before my eyes. But Harold died of a heart attack. There was nothing suspicious about it. Marcus's smile was sharp as a blade. Dorothy, what do you know about Catherine Morrison's current situation? Nothing. She disappeared 2 years ago. She didn't disappear. She's been in federal custody, cooperating with an investigation into tax evasion schemes involving several prominent Connecticut businessmen. Harold's name is at the top of that list. He slid another document across the desk. This arrived this morning. The FBI wants to interview you about your husband's business practices. The room started spinning. Marcus, what are you telling me? I'm telling you that in approximately 1 week, the federal government is going to freeze all of Harold's assets as part of their investigation. Clause 7 will automatically take effect, and you, my dear Dorothy, will become the sole heir to $40 million. He paused, letting that sink in. Wade doesn't know any of this yet. I thought about my son's smug face, his casual cruelty, his assumption that I was just a burden to be disposed of. Then I thought about Sunset Manor, about spending my final years playing bingo with strangers while Wade spent my husband's money on his wife's jewelry collection. When does this happen? I asked. The FBI raid is scheduled for next Tuesday. Wade will get the call about Clause 7 that same afternoon. Marcus leaned back in his chair, and for the first time since Harold's funeral, I saw him smile. I suggest you spend the weekend packing, but not for Sunset Manor. The weekend passed in a strange, suspended reality. Wade and Angela came by Saturday morning to discuss my transition timeline, as they called it, their voices dripping with false concern while they measured rooms for their future renovation. I served them coffee and smiled, playing the confused, grateful mother while my heart hammered with secret knowledge. We've spoken to Sunset Manor, Angela announced, pulling out a folder thick with brochures. They have an opening next week. It's really quite lovely, Mom Hartwell. You'll have your own room, 3 meals a day, and plenty of activities. I nodded along, asking appropriate questions about visiting hours and laundry services while Wade prowled through the house like he was already redecorating. He paused at Harold's study, his eyes lingering on the mahogany desk where his father had built an empire and hidden his crime. I'll need to go through Dad's papers, he said, more to himself than to me. Sort out the business details, get everything transferred properly. Of course, dear, I replied, not mentioning that Marcus had already arranged for all of Harold's important documents to be secured in a safety deposit box that only I could access. Take your time. Sunday evening, I called my sister Rose in Florida. We hadn't spoken much since Harold's funeral, but Rose had always been the practical one in our family. Rosie, it's Dorothy. I need to ask you something, and I need you not to ask questions. That sounds ominous. What's going on? If I were to show up at your house next week with a couple of suitcases and a story that would curl your hair, would you have room for me? There was a pause, then Rose's laugh, warm and familiar. Dorothy Elizabeth Hartwell, are you finally growing a backbone? Because it's about damn time. Monday morning, I did something I hadn't done in 25 years. I went shopping for myself, not for charity event clothes or funeral attire, but for the kind of wardrobe a woman with $40 million might want. I started at Nordstrom, working my way through department stores I'd forgotten existed, buying clothes that made me feel powerful instead of invisible. The sales associate at the final store, a young woman named Miranda with kind eyes, helped me pick out a navy blue suit that fit like it was custom made. Special occasion? She asked as I admired myself in the dressing room mirror. You could say that. I'm about to have a very important conversation with my son. Well, you look like a woman who means business. That's exactly what I was going for. Monday evening, I packed my real belongings, the things that mattered to me. Photo albums, my mother's jewelry, the few pieces of Harold's that held sentimental rather than monetary value. I left out 2 suitcases of old clothes, the kind of things a defeated woman might take to a nursing home. Tuesday morning arrived gray and drizzly, fitting weather for what was about to unfold. Wade called at 9 o'clock, his voice tight, with barely controlled excitement. Mom, I need you to meet me at Marcus's office at 2 o'clock. There are some documents we need to review together. Documents? Just estate stuff, technical details. Don't worry about it. But I was worrying, just not about what Wade thought. I was worrying about whether I'd have the strength to watch my son's world crumble without feeling guilty about it. Because despite everything, despite his cruelty and greed, he was still my child. At exactly noon, my doorbell rang. Through the window, I could see 3 black SUVs parked in my driveway and men men in FBI windbreakers walking toward my front door. I took a deep breath, smoothed down my new Navy suit, and went to answer the door. Mrs. Hartwell, Agent Sarah Thompson, FBI. We have a warrant to search these premises in connection with an ongoing investigation into your late husband's business practices. I stepped aside to let them in, my voice steady and cooperative. Of course, Agent Thompson. I'm afraid I don't know much about my husband's business, but I'm happy to help however I can. As federal agents swarmed through my house, photographing Harold's study and boxing up his files, I sat calmly in the living room and waited for my phone to ring. At 1:47 p.m. it did. Mom? Wade's voice was higher than usual, strained. Mom, something's happened. The FBI, they're at Dad's office, and Marcus says there's something in the will we need to discuss immediately. I'll be right there, dear. As I drove to Marcus's office, passing the FBI vehicles still parked in my driveway, I thought about the look on Wade's face when he'd told me to pack my bags, the dismissive wave of his hand when he'd called me an old lady, the complete lack of love or respect in his eyes when he'd planned to ship me off to die among strangers. Some lessons, I reflected, are worth $40 million. Marcus's conference room had never felt so small. Wade sat across from me, his face the color of old parchment, while Angela perched beside him, looking like she might actually faint. The FBI documents were spread across the mahogany table like evidence at a crime scene, which, I supposed, they essentially were. This is impossible, Wade kept repeating, his voice getting higher with each repetition. Dad was a legitimate businessman. He built that company from nothing. Marcus adjusted his glasses with the patience of a man who'd been dealing with difficult clients for 40 years. Wade, your father was indeed a brilliant businessman. Unfortunately, he was also a tax evader on a massive scale. The FBI has documentation going back 15 years. I maintained what I hoped was an appropriately shocked expression while inside. I was calculating. Harold's crimes explained so much. The sudden business trips, the late nights at the office, the way he'd insisted on handling all our finances personally. He hadn't been protecting me from the complexities of money management. He'd been protecting me from the truth. But what does this mean for the inheritance? Angela's voice was sharp with panic. Wade was supposed to inherit everything. Marcus turned to a specific page in the will, his finger tracing the text as he read. Clause 7 is very clear. In the event that the testator's business practices become the subject of federal investigation, or if criminal charges are filed posthumously, the entirety of the estate shall revert to Dorothy Elizabeth Hartwell, with all other beneficiaries receiving the sum of $1. The silence that followed was deafening. Wade stared at the paper like it was written in a foreign language, his mouth opening and closing like a fish gasping for air. $1? He whispered finally. $1, Marcus confirmed. Your father was very specific about that amount. I watched my son's face cycle through disbelief, anger, and finally, a cold calculation that reminded me uncomfortably of Harold in his worst moments. This is ridiculous. Mom doesn't know anything about running a business empire. She'll lose everything within a year. Actually, I said quietly, speaking for the first time since we'd entered the conference room, I know more than you think I do. Wade turned to me with the condescending smile he'd perfected over the years. Mom, no offense, but you've never worked a day in your life. You wouldn't know a stock option from a stock pot. That's when I decided to drop my first bomb. Wade, who do you think balanced your father's personal accounts for the past 20 years? Who do you think kept track of his investments, his property taxes, his charitable donation? I reached into my purse and pulled out a folder I'd been carrying since my meeting with Marcus. Who do you think noticed the discrepancies in his business filings that he claimed were accounting errors? The folder contained photocopies of documents I'd found in Harold's home office over the years, papers that had always made me uncomfortable, but that I'd filed away without questioning. Bank statements with odd deposits, transfer records to offshore accounts, expense reports that didn't add up. I'd kept everything, organized by date, because that's the kind of woman I was. I may have played the dutiful wife, but I wasn't blind, I continued, spreading the papers across the table. I've known about Catherine Morrison for 3 years. I've known about the missing money for even longer. I just didn't know what to do about it. Marcus was nodding approvingly. Dorothy, you've been sitting on evidence that the FBI would find very useful. Wade's face was rapidly shifting from pale to an alarming shade of red. You knew? You knew Dad was stealing, and you didn't say anything? What was I supposed to say, Wade? That your beloved father, the man you worshipped, was a criminal? That everything we owned was built on lies? I kept my voice level, but inside I was trembling with a lifetime of suppressed anger. I tried to talk to him about it once. He told me I didn't understand business, that I should stick to planning dinner parties and leave the important decisions to him. So you just let him keep doing it? I did what I thought was best for our family. I stayed quiet and I documented everything, just in case. I looked directly at my son, this man who'd called me a burden just a week ago. It turns out just in case is now. Angela finally found her voice. But what about us? What about our future? We have plans, Wade. We were going to expand the business, buy the house in the Hamptons. I felt something cold and sharp settle in my chest. Their future, their plans, as if I was already dead and buried. Angela, dear, I said, my voice sweet as poisoned honey, I'm afraid your plans will need to change, because as of this afternoon, I am the sole heir to an estate worth approximately $40 million. I paused, savoring the moment. Well, assuming the FBI doesn't seize everything, of course. Wade shot to his feet, his chair scraping against the hardwood floor. This is insane. You can't run a business. You don't know anything about real estate development or construction management. I stood as well, and for the first time in 25 years, I felt taller than my son. You're absolutely right, Wade. I don't know how to run a business. I smiled, and it felt like the first genuine smile I'd had since Harold's funeral. That's why I'm selling everything. The next morning, I woke up in my own bed for what I knew would be one of the last times. The FBI had finished their initial search, leaving the house feeling violated, but somehow cleaner, as if Harold's secrets had been aired out along with his hidden documents. I made coffee in the kitchen, where Wade had so casually dismissed me, and I planned my new life. My phone had been ringing since 6 a.m. Wade, Angela, various business associates who'd gotten wind of the FBI investigation, and reporters who somehow already knew about the inheritance scandal. I ignored them all, except for one call. Dorothy, it's Catherine Morrison. The name still made my stomach clench, but her voice sounded different than I'd expected. Tired, maybe even regretful. I suppose you're calling to gloat, I said, settling into Harold's chair in his study. It felt different now, less like his sanctuary, and more like what it actually was, the command center for a criminal enterprise. Actually, I'm calling to apologize. Catherine's laugh was bitter. I know that sounds ridiculous coming from me, but I wanted you to know that I never meant for Harold to hurt you. I was trying to protect myself, and I didn't think about what it would cost his family. I was quiet for a long moment, processing this unexpected humanization of the woman I'd seen as my enemy for so long. Why are you telling me this? Because the FBI showed me some things during my interviews, financial records that prove Harold was stealing long before I came to work for him. He'd been skimming money from his investors for almost 20 years, Dorothy. I was just the last person to figure it out. 20 years. Wade would have been 22 when Harold's crimes began, fresh out of college and eager to join the family business. Did he know? I asked. Did my son know what his father was doing? The pause on the other end of the line was answer enough. I'm sorry, Dorothy. I really am. After I hung up, I sat in Harold's chair for a long time, staring at the empty filing cabinets the FBI had cleaned out. My husband had been a thief. My son had known about it, and I, the supposedly naive wife, had been the only one actually trying to maintain some semblance of honesty in our family. The irony was almost funny. By noon, I'd made a series of phone calls that would change everything. First, to a real estate agent I'd known from charity work, a sharp woman named Patricia who specialized in high-end properties. Second, to an investment firm in New York that Harold had always dismissed as too conservative. Third, to my sister Rose in Florida. Rosie, remember when you said I should grow a backbone? Well, I think I'm about to prove that I have one made of steel. I can't wait to hear this story in person. When are you coming? Next week. I'm driving down with everything I own, which apparently is quite a lot more than I thought. Wade arrived at 2 o'clock, looking like he hadn't slept. Angela wasn't with him, which told me everything I needed to know about how their marriage was handling this particular crisis. Mom, we need to talk. He followed me into the living room, his eyes darting around the house like he was seeing it for the first time. I've been thinking about what you said yesterday, about selling everything. I've been thinking about it too. In fact, I've already started the process. The color drained from his face. What do you mean, started the process? I mean I've listed the house, contacted buyers for the business assets, and arranged to liquidate most of Harold's investment portfolio. I settled into my favorite chair, the one Harold had always said was too expensive for the living room. It turns out that when you're the sole heir to $40 million, people return your phone calls very quickly. Wade sank onto the sofa, his head in his hands. Mom, you don't understand. The business, it's not just money. It's Dad's legacy. It's everything he worked for. It's everything he stole for, I corrected gently. Wade, your father was a criminal. His legacy is fraud and tax evasion. I'm not preserving that for anyone. But what about me? What about my future? For a moment, I saw him as he'd been at 5 years old, crying because another child had taken his toy truck. The impulse to comfort him, to fix his problems, was as strong as it had ever been. But then I remembered his words from the week before, the casual cruelty in his voice when he'd called me an old lady and told me to pack my bag. Wade, last week you made it very clear that I have no place in your future. You were ready to ship me off to a nursing home without a second thought, to sell this house and spend Harold's money on your wife's designer clothes and vacation homes. I kept my voice steady, but I could feel decades of suppressed hurt rising rising to the surface. Now that the situation has changed, you want to talk about your future? That was different. I thought Dad had left everything to me. I thought it was what he wanted. And what did you think I wanted? Did you think I wanted to spend my remaining years playing bingo with strangers while you lived in my house and spent my husband's money? Wade was quiet for a long time, staring at his hand. When he finally looked up, there was something in his eyes I hadn't seen since he was a child. Shame. I'm sorry, Mom. I was selfish, and I was cruel, and I've been taking you for granted for years. His voice cracked slightly. But please, don't punish me for Dad's crimes. Don't destroy everything because you're angry at me. I studied my son's face, looking for sincerity beneath the desperation. Wade, I'm not destroying anything. I'm cleaning house. There's a difference. What does that mean? It means I'm getting rid of everything Harold built on lies and starting fresh with what's left. I leaned forward, and for the first time in our conversation, I smiled. And if you're very lucky, and if you can prove to me that you're the man I raised you to be instead of the man your father taught you to become, you might have a place in that fresh start. For the first time since the reading of the will, I saw hope flicker in Wade's eyes. What would I have to do? First, you're going to help me sell everything, and you're going to be honest with every buyer about exactly what they're purchasing. Second, you're going to cooperate fully with the FBI investigation, even if it means admitting what you knew and when you knew it. I paused, letting that sink in. And third, you're going to apologize to every investor your father defrauded, even if it takes the rest of your life. Wade nodded slowly. And then we'll see if there's enough honest money left to build something new, something clean. I stood up, smoothing down my skirt. But Wade, understand this. The old rules are gone. I'm not your father's widow anymore. I'm not the woman who stays quiet and writes checks and pretends not to notice when her family lies to her. I'm Dorothy Hartwell, and I'm $40 million richer and 40 years wiser, and I will never again let anyone treat me like I don't matter. My son looked at me like he was seeing me for the first time in his life. I understand. Good, because we start tomorrow. 3 weeks later, I stood in the empty living room of what had been my home for 25 years, watching the movers load the last of my personal belongings into a truck bound for Florida. The house had sold in 6 days to a tech entrepreneur who'd paid cash and didn't care about its connection to Harold's crimes. Everything else was following suit with surprising speed. Wade had been true to his word, working 18-hour days to help liquidate the business assets and coordinate with the FBI investigation. He'd lost 15 pounds and gained an understanding of just how deep his father's deceptions had run. Every day brought new revelation: offshore accounts Harold had hidden, investors he'd cheated, employees whose pension funds he'd raided. The Cayman Islands account alone had $3 million in it, Wade told me over coffee that morning, his voice hollow with exhaustion. Money he skimmed from the pension fund. These people trusted him with their retirement, Mom. Some of them worked for him for 30 years. I'd watched my son wrestle with the magnitude of his father's betrayal, and for the first time in years, I was proud of him. The entitled man who'd tried to ship me off to a nursing home was slowly being replaced by someone who understood the weight of responsibility. We'll make it right, I'd told him. Every penny we can recover goes back to the people Harold stole from. Whatever's left after that, we'll decide what to do with together. The FBI investigation had uncovered $18 million in hidden assets, money that legally belonged to me under Clause 7, but morally belonged to Harold's victims. I'd made the decision to return all of it, a choice that had surprised Agent Thompson and shocked Wade. Mrs. Hartwell, you're under no legal obligation to return these funds, the agent had explained. Your husband hid this money specifically to keep it from his creditors and the IRS. Agent Thompson, my husband was a thief. I don't want money he stole, even if I can legally keep it. I'd signed the papers transferring the hidden accounts back to the FBI for distribution to Harold's victims. Some things are more important than money. Wade had watched me sign away $18 million without a word of protest, and I'd seen something shift in his face. Respect, maybe, or possibly just a belated understanding of who his mother actually was. Now, as I locked the front door of our Connecticut house for the final time, Wade stood beside me with a single suitcase of his own. Are you sure about this? He asked. Aunt Rose barely knows me. What if she doesn't want both of us showing up? I smiled, thinking of my sister's reaction when I'd called to warn her about Wade joining me. Rosie said, and I quote, "It's about time that boy learned what his mother is made of. Bring him down here, and I'll help you turn him into a decent human being." The drive to Florida took 2 days, and somewhere around Georgia, Wade and I had the first honest conversation we'd had in 20 years. He told me about the pressure Harold had put on him to join the business, the way his father had gradually introduced him to the illegal aspects of their operations, the guilt and fear he'd lived with for years. I knew it was wrong, Mom. I knew Dad was stealing, but he made it seem like everyone did it, like it was just how business worked. and by the time I understood how bad it really was, I was so deep in it that I couldn't see a way out. I told him about the loneliness of my marriage, the way Harold had gradually isolated me from decision-making, the years I'd spent feeling invisible in my own life. I stayed because I thought that's what good wives did. I kept quiet because I thought it was protecting our family. I was wrong. When we pulled into Rose's driveway in Sarasota, my sister was waiting on the porch with a pitcher of sweet tea and a knowing smile. At 65, Rose had the same silver hair as me, but twice the confidence, earned through a successful career as a nurse and 2 marriages to men who'd respected her strength instead of trying to diminish it. "Well, well," she said, as Wade and I climbed out of the car. "Look what the cat dragged in." My baby sister and the son who thought he could put her in a nursing home. Wade had the grace to blush. "Aunt Rose, I owe you and Mom a lot of apologies." "Yes, you do. But apologies are just words, boy. What matters is what you do going forward." Rose hugged him anyway, then turned to me with tears in her eyes. "Dorothy Elizabeth, you look like a woman who finally remembered she has a spine." That night, sitting on Rose's screened porch and listening to the sound of waves in the distance, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years. Peace. Not the exhausted quiet of submission, but the deep calm that comes from finally living your own life. My phone buzzed with a text from Marcus Reed. "FBI has recovered another $2.3 million from Harold's Swiss account. Also, Patricia found buyers for the last 3 properties. You're officially out of the real estate business." I showed the message to Wade, who was sprawled in a wicker chair looking more relaxed than I'd seen him since childhood. "What's the total?" he asked, after returning everything to Harold's victims and paying the legal fees. "About $22 million. I set down my phone and looked at my son seriously. "Wade, I want you to understand something. That money isn't mine, and it's not yours. It's our chance to build something honest, something we can be proud of." "What did you have in mind?" I'd been thinking about this for weeks, ever since Agent Thompson had shown me the list of Harold's victims: retirees who'd lost their life savings, small business owners who'd been cheated out of contract, employees whose pension funds had been raided, people whose lives had been destroyed by my husband's greed. "I want to start a foundation," I said, "something that helps people rebuild after they've been victims of financial fraud. Legal assistance, counseling, emergency funds to help them get back on their feet." Wade was quiet for a moment, then nodded slowly. "Dad would hate it." "Yes, he would. That's how I know it's the right thing to do." Rose raised her glass of sweet tea in a toast to Dorothy Elizabeth Hartwell, who finally stopped letting dead men make her decisions. As we sat there in the Florida warmth, I thought about the woman I'd been a month ago, confused and grieving and ready to accept whatever scraps of dignity my family was willing to throw me. That woman felt like a stranger now, someone I might pity but could no longer understand. The new Dorothy Hartwell had $22 million, a son who was learning to respect her, and a sister who'd always believed she was stronger than she knew. More importantly, she had a purpose that had nothing to do with charity galas or dutiful widowhood. Tomorrow, I would start building something new, something clean, something that would help people instead of stealing from them. Harold would have called it a waste of money, which was exactly why I knew it was going to be perfect. 6 months later, I stood in the conference room of what used to be Harold's downtown office building, now renamed the Hartwell Foundation for Financial Recovery, watching as our first group of clients received checks that would help them rebuild their lives. Margaret Santos, a 73-year-old woman who'd lost her retirement savings to Harold's pension fund scheme, cried as she thanked me for the 4th time. "Mrs. Hartwell, I can't believe this is real. When that FBI agent called to tell me about the foundation, I thought it was another scam." I handed her tissues from the box Wade had strategically placed on every table in the room. In 6 months, my son had transformed from a reluctant participant to the foundation's most dedicated advocate, throwing himself into the work of repairing his father's damage with the passion of a man seeking redemption. "Margaret, this is just the beginning," I told her. "We've also arranged for you to meet with our legal team about pursuing additional compensation through the Federal Victims Fund." The transformation in Wade had been remarkable to watch. The entitled businessman who'd tried to ship me off to a nursing home had evolved into someone I actually enjoyed being around. He'd cut his hair shorter, traded his expensive suits for clothes that didn't scream money, and developed a work ethic that would have impressed even Harold. More importantly, he'd learned to listen. "Mom, we need to talk about the Davidson case," he said later that afternoon, as we reviewed files in what used to be Harold's private office. I'd redecorated completely, replacing Harold's intimidating mahogany furniture with comfortable chairs and walls covered in letters from people we'd helped. "What about it? James Davidson lost his house because Dad defaulted on a construction loan, right? But I've been going through the paperwork, and I think Dad actually completed that project and just never told Davidson. If I'm right, the house should have been paid for years ago." I looked up from the grant application I was reviewing. 6 months ago, Wade wouldn't have noticed if one of Harold's victims was sleeping in a cardboard box. Now he was staying staying up nights reviewing old contracts, looking for ways to right his father's wrong. How much detective work did this take? Wade grinned, and I saw traces of the little boy he'd been before Harold had molded him into a miniature version of himself. About 12 hours and 3 pots of coffee. But I found the completion certificate buried in Dad's files. Davidson's house was finished in 2018, but Dad kept the paperwork and foreclosed on him anyway. So Harold stole a man's house even though it was already paid for. Pretty much. But here's the good news. Davidson's still alive, still renting a 1-bedroom apartment across town, and the current owners of his house are willing to sell it back to him for what they paid at the foreclosure auction. I felt that familiar mixture of rage and satisfaction that came with every new revelation about Harold's crimes. Rage at the scope of his cruelty, satisfaction at our ability to fix it. Set up the meeting. And Wade, yeah? Your father would be ashamed of you right now. Wade's grin widened. Thanks, Mom. That's the nicest thing you've said to me all week. My phone rang, interrupting our moment. Angela's name appeared on the screen. The first time she'd called since the divorce papers had been finalized 3 months earlier. Dorothy, it's Angela. I was wondering if we could talk. I'd expected this call eventually. Angela had fought the divorce initially, claiming Wade was having some kind of breakdown and that she could help him through it. But faced with a husband who'd chosen honesty over wealth and a foundation that demanded long hours for no salary, she'd decided to cut her losses. What can I do for you, Angela? I wanted to apologize for the way I treated you. The nursing home thing, pressuring Wade to get you out of the house. I was greedy and I was wrong. I watched Wade through the glass wall of my office as he talked animatedly on the phone with what looked like good news for one of our clients. What's really going on, Angela? There was a long pause. I'm dating someone new, Charles Morrison. He's in real estate development. And when I told him about Wade's family situation, he asked me some questions that made me realize, well, that I might have been on the wrong side of things. Charles Morrison, Catherine Morrison's younger brother, if I remembered correctly. The irony was almost too perfect. Angela, I appreciate the apology, but I think it's a little late for that, don't you? I know it is. But Dorothy, I wanted you to know that what you and Wade are doing with the foundation, it's incredible. Charles showed me some articles about your work, and I realized that the man I married would never have been capable of what Wade's doing now. She was right about that. The Wade who'd tried to institutionalize me 6 months ago would never have spent his Saturday afternoon helping a 70-year-old man reclaim the house Harold had stolen from him. Wade's become the man I always hoped he could be, I said. It just took losing everything for him to find it. And you? How are you doing with all this? I looked around my office with its comfortable furniture and walls full of thank you letters from people whose lives we'd helped rebuild. Through the window, I could see the Tampa Bay waterfront, where I now lived in a modest condo that was entirely mine. No husband's legacy to maintain, no son's expectations to meet, no one's approval to seek but my own. Angela, I'm 70 years old. I run a foundation that gives away millions of dollars. My son actually respects me for the first time in decades, and I go to bed every night knowing that I spent the day making the world a little better than I found it. I paused, thinking about the woman I'd been when Angela first suggested putting me in a nursing home. I've never been happier in my life. After I hung up, Wade knocked on my office door. Good news or bad news first? Always good news first. James Davidson's getting his house back. The current owners just agreed to sell, and we're covering the full purchase price plus moving expenses. Wade's face was practically glowing with satisfaction. He cried on the phone, Mom. A 70-year-old man cried because he gets to go home. And the bad news? Channel 8 wants to do a feature story on the foundation. They're calling it The Widow's Revenge, how one woman turned her husband's crimes into justice. Wade rolled his eyes. I told them you don't do interviews, but they're pretty persistent. I thought about that for a moment. 6 months ago, the idea of public attention would have terrified me, but the woman who'd been afraid of Harold's disapproval was gone, replaced by someone who understood that her story might inspire other people to find their own strength. Set it up, I said, but I want James Davidson there to tell his story. This isn't about my revenge. It's about his recovery. Wade nodded, then hesitated at the door. Mom, I know I've said this before, but I want to say it again. I'm sorry for the way I treated you after Dad died. I'm sorry it took all this to make me realize what kind of woman raised me. Wade, you don't need to keep apologizing. You've spent 6 months proving that you're sorry through your actions. I know, but I want to make sure you know that even if we'd never found Clause 7, even if the FBI had never investigated Dad, even if everything had gone the way I planned it, he paused, searching for the right words, I would have spent the rest of my life regretting how I treated you that week. I stood up and hugged my son, this man who'd finally learned to value character over cash. The good news is, we'll never have to find out. As Wade left to call the television station, I turned back to my window overlooking the bay. Somewhere out there, Harold's other victims were slowly rebuilding their lives, using money that had once been hidden in offshore accounts to pay for groceries and medical bills, and dreams they'd thought were were lost forever. Harold had spent 20 years stealing from people who trusted him. With any luck, I'd spend the next 20 years giving it all back. The old Dorothy would have called that justice. The new Dorothy called it a pretty good start. The Channel 8 interview aired on a Tuesday evening in February, exactly 1 year after Harold's funeral. I watched it from Rose's living room, surrounded by the family I'd chosen instead of the one I'd been born into. Wade sat on the floor next to James Davidson, who'd driven down from Tampa specifically to watch himself on television for the first time in his 72 years. "Mrs. Hartwell," the reporter had asked during filming, "how does it feel to know that your husband stole millions from hardworking people?" I'd looked directly into the camera when I answered, thinking about all the wives who might be watching, women who suspected their husbands were hiding things but didn't know what to do about it. It feels like a betrayal of everything I thought I knew about my life, but it also feels like an opportunity to prove that you don't have to be defined by someone else's crimes, even when that someone is your husband. The interview had sparked something I wasn't prepared for. Calls and emails from across the country, women who recognized themselves in my story, wives who'd discovered their husband's affairs, embezzlement, tax evasion, or worse, women who'd been told they were too old, too naive, too dependent to survive on their own. "Dorothy, you're going to need to hire staff just to handle the correspondence," Rose said, as she brought me a stack of letters that had arrived that morning. "This one's from a woman in Oregon whose husband has been stealing from his law firm's client accounts." I read the letter, my heart aching for another woman who'd spent years ignoring red flags and making excuses. Margaret Chen had been married for 35 years to a man who'd been embezzling money from his law practice to fund a gambling addiction. She'd discovered the truth when FBI agents showed up at her door with a warrant, just like they had with me. "She wants to know if there's a support group for spouses of white-collar criminals," Wade said, reading over my shoulder. "Mom, maybe that's something we should think about adding to the foundation." The foundation had grown beyond anything I'd imagined. What had started as a simple victims' compensation fund had evolved into a comprehensive support network offering legal aid, financial counseling, and emotional support for people rebuilding their lives after fraud. We'd helped more than 200 families in the past year, returning over $15 million to Harold's victims and helping them navigate the complex process of recovery. But the letters showed me that there was another group of victims I hadn't considered, the family members who discovered they'd been living with criminals. "You know what we need?" I said, an idea forming. "We need a retreat, somewhere women like Margaret can come to learn that they're not alone, that they don't have to carry their husband's shame." Rose looked up from the letter she was reading. "A retreat where?" I'd been thinking about this for months, actually. One of Harold's properties that we hadn't sold, a small conference center in the North Carolina mountains that he'd used for business meetings. It was isolated, peaceful, and already equipped with meeting rooms and overnight accommodations. I kept the property in Asheville, the mountaintop conference center. We could convert it into a residential program for spouses and family members of financial criminals. Wade was already pulling out his laptop. "I'll start researching what permits we'd need." "But Mom, this is brilliant. There's nothing like this anywhere in the country." Over the next 6 months, we transformed Harold's old business retreat into something he would have hated, a place where his victims' families could heal. The Hartwell Recovery Center opened in September with its first group of 12 women, ranging in age from 35 to 78, all dealing with the aftermath of discovering their husband's crimes. I'd decided to facilitate the first group myself, drawing on a year of experience helping Harold's victims and my own journey from naive wife to empowered widow. The women arrived on a Sunday afternoon, looking shell-shocked and suspicious, the way I'd felt that day in Marcus's office when he'd first mentioned Clause 7. "My name is Dorothy Hartwell," I told them as we gathered in the main conference room on Monday morning. "1 year ago, I discovered that my husband of 43 years was a criminal who'd stolen millions of dollars from people who trusted him. I thought my life was over." Margaret Chen, the woman from Oregon, raised her hand tentatively. "How do you get past the shame? Everyone in our town knows what David did. I can't go to the grocery store without people staring at me." "The shame isn't yours to carry," I said, remembering the words Rose had said to me during my first week in Florida. "You didn't commit the crimes. You didn't choose to steal from anyone. You were a victim too, and victims don't owe their abusers' crimes to anyone." Over the course of the week, I watched these women transform the way Wade had transformed, the way I had transformed. They shared their stories, their anger, their fear of an uncertain future. They learned about their legal rights, their financial options, their emotional boundaries. On Friday afternoon, as we sat in a circle for our final group session, Margaret spoke up again. "Dorothy, I want to ask you something, and I hope you'll be honest with me." "Of course. Do you ever miss him?" "Your husband, I mean. Even knowing what he did, do you ever miss the life you had before you found out?" I thought about that carefully. Did I miss Harold? The man who'd built his fortune on other people's misery, who'd hidden his crime crimes from me for 20 years, who'd raised our son to be entitled and cruel. I miss the person I thought he was, I said finally. I miss the security of believing I was married to a good man, but I don't miss the woman I was when I lived that lie. The woman who stayed quiet when she should have spoken up, who accepted disrespect because she was afraid of conflict, who let other people make all her important decisions. I looked around the circle at these brave women who'd traveled hundreds of miles to heal. That woman was comfortable, but she wasn't free. Margaret nodded, tears in her eyes. I think I understand. The truth is hard, I continued. Learning that your life has been built on lies is devastating, but it's also liberating, because once you know the truth, you can decide what to do with it. You can choose to be a victim forever, or you can choose to build something better with what's left. After the women left on Saturday morning, promising to stay in touch and return for our quarterly reunion weekends, I walked the grounds of the conference center alone. The autumn leaves were spectacular in the North Carolina mountains, and the air was crisp and clean in a way that made me feel grateful to be alive. My phone rang as I was sitting on a bench overlooking the valley below. Wade's name appeared on the screen. Mom, I just got off the phone with Agent Thompson. They arrested another one of Dad's associates, Richard Brennan. Apparently, he's been running the same kind of pension fund scam Dad was using, but on a smaller scale. Richard Brennan. I remembered him from Harold's funeral, a slick man in an expensive suit who'd offered his condolences while his eyes calculated the business opportunities my husband's death might create. How many victims this time? About 50. But here's the thing, Mom. Agent Thompson says Brennan's been telling his victims that his schemes are legitimate because Harold Hartwell did the same thing for years and never got caught. The irony was bitter, but not surprising. Harold's crimes were still generating new victims, his methods being copied by other greedy men who thought they were smarter than the FBI. What can we do to help? I'm already working on it. I called Patricia to see if we can expedite the victim compensation process, and I reached out to 3 of Brennan's victims to let them know about our legal aid program. Wade paused. But Mom, this is going to keep happening. As long as there are men like Dad who think they can steal without consequences, there are going to be new victims who need our help. Then we'd better make sure we're ready for them. As I hung up and walked back toward the conference center, I thought about the woman I'd been 2 years ago, planning Harold's funeral and believing I was about to become a burden on my ungrateful son. That woman could never have imagined she'd end up running a multi-million-dollar foundation, opening a recovery center, or spending her days helping other people rebuild their lives. Harold had left me $40 million and a lifetime of guilt about how he'd earned it. But in trying to hide his crimes, he'd also left me something more valuable, the legal mechanism to take control of my own life. Clause 7 had been his insurance policy, his way of protecting his assets from federal seizure. Instead, it had become my Declaration of Independence. Tomorrow, I'd fly back to Florida to spend Thanksgiving with Rose and plan the foundation's expansion into 3 new states. Wade would join us, along with his new girlfriend Maria, a legal aid attorney who'd impressed him by caring more about his character than his bank account. But tonight, I'd sit in the conference center where Harold used to plan his crimes and read thank you letters from the people whose lives we'd helped rebuild. And I'd remember that sometimes the most powerful revenge is living well enough to lift up the people your enemies tried to destroy. The old Dorothy would have called that justice. The new Dorothy called it love. 2 years after the FBI raid, I was sitting in a federal courthouse in Manhattan, watching Wade testify against his father's former business partner in what the media had dubbed the largest pension fraud case in Connecticut history. Richard Brennan sat at the defendant's table, his expensive suit and arrogant demeanor reminding me painfully of Harold in his worst moments. Wade had been on the witness stand for 3 hours, methodically explaining how Harold's criminal enterprise had operated and how Brennan had expanded on those methods to steal from his own victims. My son's voice was steady, professional, and completely without the entitlement that had once defined him. Mr. Hartwell, the prosecutor continued, when you first learned about your father's illegal activities, what was your reaction? Wade glanced at me briefly before answering. I was terrified. My father had taught me that what we were doing was normal, that everyone in business bent the rules to get ahead. It took me years to understand that what we were actually doing was destroying people's lives. And what changed your perspective? My mother. Wade's voice carried a note of pride that made my heart swell. After the FBI investigation, she could have walked away with millions of dollars in legally clean money. Instead, she chose to return everything to my father's victims and dedicate her life to helping others who'd been defrauded. She showed me what integrity actually looks like. like. Brennan's defense attorney objected to the testimony as irrelevant, but the damage was done. The jury had seen Wade's transformation from entitled criminal to reformed advocate, and I could see in their faces that they understood the power of choosing redemption over greed. During the lunch recess, Wade and I sat in a small cafe near the courthouse, picking at sandwiches while reporters waited outside for statements we had no intention of giving. "How are you feeling?" I asked. "Nervous, relieved, grateful that I get to be on this side of the courtroom instead of that one." Wade studied his coffee cup. "Mom, can I ask you something?" "Of course. Do you think Dad knew? When he wrote Clause 7, do you think he knew that giving you control of everything would turn you into someone who'd use his money to help his victims?" I'd wondered about that myself many times over the past 2 years. Had Harold suspected that I was stronger than I appeared? Had he known that given the chance, I'd choose justice over comfort? "I think your father underestimated me for 43 years, I said finally. "I don't think he stopped underestimating me when he died." Wade nodded thoughtfully. "I'm glad he was wrong about you. I'm glad you figured that out before it was too late." That afternoon, the jury deliberated for less than 2 hours before returning a guilty verdict on all counts. Brennan would spend the next 20 years in federal prison, and his victims would receive compensation through a fund we'd helped establish. Justice, slow but inevitable. Outside the courthouse, Agent Thompson approached us with something I'd never seen on her face before, a smile. "Mrs. Hartwell, I wanted to thank you personally. Your foundation's cooperation in this case made all the difference. Without the documentation you preserved from your husband's files, we never would have been able to prove the connection between his methods and Brennan's operation. I'm just glad something good came from Harold's papers, more than you know. This conviction is going to help us prosecute 12 other cases involving similar schemes. Your husband may have been a criminal, but the evidence he left behind is going to put a lot of other criminals in prison." As Wade and I walked back to our hotel that evening, my phone rang with a call from Rose. "Dorothy, you need to get back here. There's been a development." "What kind of development?" "The good kind. Channel 8 just called. They want to do a follow-up story about the foundation, but this time it's not just local. They're talking about national coverage. 60 minutes, Dorothy. They want to interview you for 60 minutes. I stopped walking, causing Wade to bump into me on the busy sidewalk. "Rose, I'm not sure I'm ready for that kind of attention." "Honey, you've been ready for that kind of attention your whole life. You just needed to discover you were worth paying attention to." That night, I sat in my hotel room and thought about the path that had led me from Harold's funeral to a federal courthouse to a potential appearance on national television. 3 years ago, I'd been a woman whose greatest fear was disappointing her husband. Now I was someone whose story might inspire other women to find their own strength. The next morning, Wade and I flew back to Florida, where the foundation staff was already fielding calls from reporters, documentary filmmakers, and literary agents who wanted to tell my story. The attention felt surreal, but also somehow inevitable. "Mrs. Hartwell," my assistant Jennifer said, as she handed me a stack of messages. "I think you need to see this one first." The message was from Margaret Chen, the woman from Oregon who'd attended our first retreat weekend. She'd written to tell me that she'd testified against her own husband in his embezzlement trial, using techniques we'd taught her about overcoming shame and speaking truth to power. "Dorothy, I wanted you to know that David was convicted yesterday on all counts. He'll serve 8 years in federal prison, and I'll never have to see him again unless I choose to. More importantly, his victims will get their money back, and I'll be able to rebuild my life with a clean conscience. Thank you for showing me that it's possible to be stronger than your worst day." I handed the letter to Wade, who read it with the same mixture of pride and amazement that I felt. "Mom, do you realize what you've done? You've created a movement. Women all over the country are finding the courage to speak up because they saw you do it first." A movement. The word felt too big for what I'd done, which was simply refuse to accept the role of victim that everyone expected me to play. But maybe that was exactly what a movement was. One person's refusal to accept what everyone else thought was inevitable. That afternoon, I called the 60 Minutes producer and agreed to the interview. If my story could help other women find their voices, then I owed it to them to tell it as widely as possible. "But I have one condition," I told the producer. "I want to bring some of the women who've been through our program. This isn't just my story, it's theirs too." 3 weeks later, I sat across from Leslie Stahl in the conference room of the Hartwell Recovery Center, surrounded by 12 women who'd found the strength to rebuild their lives after discovering their husband's crimes. The cameras were rolling, the lights were bright, and for the first time in my life, I felt like exactly the right person to be in exactly the right place. "Mrs. Hartwell," Leslie Stahl asked, "when your son told you to pack your bags and move to a nursing home, did you ever imagine you'd end up here?" I looked around the room at the women who'd become my chosen family, these brave souls who'd traveled from across the country to tell their stories on national television. Margaret Chen from Oregon, Patricia Williams from Texas, Sandra Martinez from Florida, and 9 others who'd refused to let their husband's crimes define their futures. Leslie, 3 years ago, I was a woman who'd never made an important decision in her life. I let my husband handle the money, my son make the plans, and everyone else decide what was best for me. I smiled, thinking about the person I'd been and the person I'd become. That woman could never have imagined she was capable of any of this, but she also never imagined how strong she'd be when she finally stopped asking for permission to live her own life. As the interview continued, I realized that Harold's greatest crime hadn't been stealing money from his investors. It had been stealing 43 years of my life by convincing me I was too weak to handle the truth. Clause 7 had given me his money, but discovering his lies had given me something far more valuable, myself. The old Dorothy would have called that ironic. The new Dorothy called it perfect justice. 5 years after Harold's funeral, I stood in the ballroom of the Ritz-Carlton in New York City, accepting the Presidential Citizens Medal from a president who praised my work as an example of how ordinary people can accomplish extraordinary things when they refuse to accept injustice. The medal was beautiful, heavy gold on a blue ribbon, but what mattered more were the faces in the audience. Wade sat in the front row next to his wife Maria and their 6-month-old daughter, Dorothy Elizabeth Hartwell Santos, my first grandchild and the most perfect baby ever born. Rose was there with her new boyfriend, a retired teacher who appreciated her fierce independence. Margaret Chen had flown in from Oregon with her own daughter, whom she was finally able to face after years of shame. But the faces that mattered most were scattered throughout the ballroom. 247 women who'd participated in our recovery programs, hundreds of Harold's victims who'd rebuilt their lives with the Foundation's help, and dozens of federal agents who'd used our research to prosecute financial criminals across the country. Mrs. Hartwell's foundation has recovered over $60 million for fraud victims, the president said as I stood beside him on the stage. But more importantly, she's proven that healing is possible, that victims can become survivors, and that sometimes the most powerful response to injustice is helping others find their strength. After the ceremony, I found myself in a quiet corner of the reception, holding my granddaughter and marveling at how much my life had changed since the day Wade had told me to pack my bag. "Penny for your thoughts," Wade said, joining me with 2 glasses of champagne. "I was thinking about your father," I admitted, wondering what he'd make of all this. Wade considered that for a moment. "I think he'd be furious that his money is being used to help the people he stole from, but I also think he'd be shocked that you turned out to be the strongest person in our family. I was always strong." "Wade, I just never had the chance to prove it, or the permission." That was exactly right. For 43 years, I'd waited for permission to have opinions, to make decisions, to live my own life. Harold's death and Wade's cruelty had finally forced me to stop waiting. My phone buzzed with a text from Jennifer back at the Foundation office. "Mrs. H, you need to see this. Channel 8 just broke a story about a pension fraud scheme in Alabama. 89 victims. They're using the Hartwell method again." I showed the message to Wade, who shook his head in disgust. "Some people never learn." "No, but we do." I handed baby Dorothy back to her father and pulled out my phone to call Agent Thompson. "And we've gotten very good at teaching consequences." Over the next 6 months, the Foundation expanded into Alabama, working with federal investigators to help the pension fraud victims while tracking down assets the perpetrator had hidden. It was our largest case yet, involving a conspiracy that had stolen over $40 million from retirees across 3 states. The mastermind turned out to be Harold's former accountant, a man named Stephen Walsh, who'd attended Harold's funeral and offered his condolences while secretly planning to use Harold's methods for his own scheme. "Mrs. Hartwell," Agent Thompson told me during one of our strategy meetings, "Walsh kept copies of your husband's files. He's been using Harold's playbook like a how-to manual for financial fraud." The irony was nauseating, but not surprising. Harold's crimes had become a blueprint for other criminals, his methods spreading like a virus through the white-collar crime community. But what these new criminals hadn't counted on was that Harold's victims had organized, that his widow had weaponized his money against them, and that his reformed son had dedicated his life to stopping them. "How many more are out there?" I asked. "How many other criminals are using Harold's methods? Based on what we've seen in the past 5 years, probably dozens. Your husband was apparently considered a genius in certain criminal circles." A genius. Harold would have been pleased by that assessment, even if it was describing his ability to steal from people who trusted him. "Agent Thompson, I want to make you an offer," I said. "The Foundation has enough money to fund a specialized unit focused on financial fraud cases involving Harold's methods. Investigators, prosecutors, victim advocates, the whole package. What would it take to make that happen? 6 months later, the Hartwell Financial Crimes Task Force was operational, a joint effort between the FBI, the Foundation, and 3 federal prosecutors' offices. We'd helped convict 12 criminals in our first year, recovered over $100 million for their victims, and prevented an estimated $300 million in additional fraud through early intervention. But the real victory wasn't in the numbers. It was in the phone calls from women who'd found the courage to report their husbands' crimes, the emails from fraud victims who'd refused to accept their losses as inevitable, and the letters from children who'd watched their parents rebuild their lives after financial devastation. "You've created something that will outlive all of us," Rose told me during one of our weekly phone calls. "Harold thought he was building a legacy with his stolen money. Instead, he gave you the tools to build something that actually matters." That evening, I sat in my Florida condo with baby Dorothy on my lap, reading her a story about a princess who saved herself instead of waiting for someone else to rescue her. Wade and Maria were in the kitchen making dinner, their voices mixing with the sound of waves outside my window. At 73, I was healthier, happier, and more purposeful than I'd been at any point in my first 70 years. I had meaningful work, genuine relationships, and the deep satisfaction that came from using power to help people instead of hurt them. Harold had left me $40 million, intending it as a consolation prize for a lifetime of quiet obedience. Instead, he'd given me the resources to become the woman I was always meant to be, someone who chose love over fear, justice over comfort, and truth over the easy lie of willful ignorance. My phone rang, interrupting story time. Jennifer's name appeared on the screen. "Mrs. H, sorry to call so late, but I thought you'd want to know. We just got a call from a woman in Seattle whose husband has been stealing from his medical practice. She saw your 60 Minutes interview 3 years ago and finally worked up the courage to report him." "What's her name?" "Linda Morrison. She says she's been married for 32 years and never suspected anything until the FBI showed up at her door this morning." Linda Morrison. Another woman whose life had been built on lies. Another victim of a man she'd trusted completely. In a few hours, she'd be where I'd been 5 years ago, shocked, grieving, and terrified of an uncertain future. But unlike me, Linda Morrison wouldn't face that future alone. She'd have the Foundation's resources, the Recovery Center's programs, and the support of hundreds of women who'd walked the same path before her. "Jennifer, book me a flight to Seattle for tomorrow morning. And call the Recovery Center to see if we can arrange an emergency slot for Linda in next month's program." "Will do." "Mrs. H, you should know that Linda specifically asked to speak with you. She said she needs to talk to someone who understands what it's like to discover that your entire life has been a lie." As I hung up and resumed reading to baby Dorothy, I thought about the woman I'd been 5 years ago, broken and defeated in the kitchen where Wade had told me to pack my bag. That woman could never have imagined she'd spend her 70s flying around the country to help strangers rebuild their lives. But she also never imagined how much strength she had hidden inside her. Harold had spent 20 years stealing from people who trusted him, accumulating money and power he thought would make him immortal. Instead, his crimes had become the foundation for something bigger than he'd ever built, a movement of women who refused to let other people's lies define their limit. Wade appeared in the doorway with a bottle of wine and a smile. "Mom, dinner's ready, but first, Maria wants to make a toast." In the dining room, my daughter-in-law raised her glass with tears in her eyes. "To Dorothy, who taught us that it's never too late to become who you were meant to be. And to baby Dorothy, who will grow up knowing that strength and kindness are not opposite, but partners." As we clinked glasses, I looked around the table at the family I'd gained by refusing to accept the family I'd lost. Wade, who'd learned to value character over cash. Maria, who'd chosen to love a reformed man instead of a rich one. Baby Dorothy, who would grow up in a world where her grandmother's story proved that ordinary women could accomplish extraordinary things. Harold's greatest triumph had been convincing me I was powerless. His greatest failure had been underestimating what I'd do with power once I finally claimed it. The old Dorothy would have called that poetic justice. The new Dorothy called it the best possible life, one spent lifting others up instead of tearing them down, building instead of destroying, choosing love over fear every single day. Tomorrow I'd fly to Seattle to help another woman discover her own strength. But tonight I'd hold my granddaughter and remember that sometimes the most powerful revenge is refusing to let someone else's worst instincts become your life's limitations. Clause 7 had given me Harold's money, but choosing what to do with it had given me something infinitely more valuable. The chance to prove that it's never too late to become the hero of your own story. And that, I thought as baby Dorothy fell asleep in my arms, was worth every penny Harold had ever stolen. Thanks for listening. Don't forget to subscribe and feel free to share your story in the comments. Your voice matters.